everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hey, Rob, it's Diana.
And it's me, your best friend, Jackie.
Oh, wow. Well, we are ready to talk to you about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research. And by ready, I mean not ready, because I don't know about all of you, but for some of you listeners, I'm sure you've just enjoyed a fabulous holiday time. Maybe you've seen family. Maybe you just took some time off. And I don't know about you, Jackie and Diana, but it pretty much takes about 1 week of not doing the podcast to completely forget how to do a podcast. So I thought, why don't we pick a topic that is just so easy? There's no way we can mess it up, even after, a week or more off from recording. What do you say?
I love that idea.
I like easy.
Okay, so I was thinking, what's easy? I was like, training other people, training other professionals. That's, that can be pretty easy. We talk about that a lot in the show. Okay, so training's good, right?
Yep.
Okay, then I thought, what else is easy? And I thought ethics, always easy, always a simple answer. It's usually right in front of your face. If you know the code, it's slam dunk, right? Easy, ethics.
Black and white.
Yeah, ethics is very concrete, right?
Okay, good. Concrete, that's right. There's only one answer in any given situation. Very rarely is there a conflicting situation. Then I thought, you know what? Let's hat trick another easy topic. Cultural responsiveness. It's pretty simple. We're all pretty good at it just by, thinking hard and really wanting to do a good job. No one ever telling us what to do. We kind of just stumble into it, right? It's cultural responsiveness.
Yeah.
Good. So we got ethics, teaching, cultural responsiveness. We'll put them together. Easiest podcast we could ever do.
I love it. I can't wait to get started. That sounds like the easiest thing ever.
Do we even need articles to discuss this week? Or we could
let's just wing it.
Off the dome. Okay, here we go. Of course, I'm kidding. We did pick a topic that is going to be a bit challenging, I think, but it is one that we've talked about before on the show. It's an extension of a talk we actually did at the Thompson Center, and that is the ethics of teaching cultural responsiveness. Before, we just focused on the supervision aspects, but we thought, let's go back. We want to look at some of the ethics of teaching cultural responsiveness in our field. So again, a topic that we've done in some manner, often with guests, but this time we have some articles that we really liked and that we are very excited to share. But again, just a joke at the top. These are not easy topics at all.
Just a little joke.
Just a little joke. But they are ones that are very important for us as practitioners, and ones too that are important for us to be able to talk about. And the more we talk about them, the better we are at having a fluent conversation about a challenging topic. So this week we're going to be talking about 3 articles. The first article is Sellers, Alai-Rosales, MacDonald from 2016's Behavior Analysis and Practice, and it's called Taking Full Responsibility, the Ethics of Supervision in Behavior Analytic Practice. We're also going to be talking about Munoz, DoBroka, and Mohammad's 2009 article in the Journal of Nursing Education called Development of a Multidisciplinary Course in Cultural Competence for Nursing and Human Service Professions. And finally, we'll be talking about Roger Siren and Siren, 2009 article from the Journal of Diversity in Higher Education, Cultural Competence as an Ethical Requirement, Introducing a New Educational Model.
Dun, dun, dun.
There we go. So we've got...
Those sound like very intriguing articles.
And easy.
Super easy.
Right?
We got this. No problems. So why don't we start by doing the easy thing, which is defining terms. So we are going to be talking about terms like culture, cultural identity, cultural competence, cultural variables, all those good terms. So does anyone want to take a crack at defining culture in a behavior analytic way?
Now I know how my students feel. I'll just keep very silent and maybe they won't call on me.
Eventually we have to finish the podcast, so So when we talk about culture, I think one way that I like to think of culture in terms of behavior analytic language would be thinking about various contingencies of reinforcement that prevail in the environment in which we were born and that we will then experience throughout our lives. And this has been pretty similar definition of culture from, Skinner. I think that was pretty much his definition when he was writing about culture back in 71. And then again, this has been pretty consistent through even more recent articles. There's a Beaulieu article about cultural competence that uses that definition. You can also think of culture as sort of the extent to which a group of individuals engage in overt and verbal behavior that reflects shared behavioral learning histories, which differentiates one group from another group and allows for some amount of prediction of how individuals within that group will act given specific environmental conditions. And again, I know it sounds like I just made that myself. No, that's from Sugai, who's also written a lot about culture. That's a 2012 article. You want to paraphrase from the best when you can. So that defines the idea of culture. And then when we talk about something like cultural identity, what we're talking about the sort of unique sets of stimuli and response classes that an individual have within that sort of cultural framework. And then finally, when we talk about cultural competence, here's where we're talking about how we as practitioners can adapt the care we give to be congruent with a client's specific culture. Cultural competence would also include, say, taking responsibility for educating ourselves on the variety of cultural backgrounds of the individuals we work with, accepting and respecting that there are differences between cultures, and then also making sure that we're not just doing that like, I accept that there are different cultures. We also have to kind of take it to the next level, which is understanding how the respect and understanding of these cultural differences will allow us to facilitate the client and the family's abilities to make decisions which will meet their needs and follow along with their own personal beliefs. And then, of course, continuing to do this over and over and over. It's not like I read the book on culture and now I'm all done. It's a process that will continue on. Just knowing one family from one cultural background does not mean now I can work with every family from this cultural background, because there are lots of subcultures within any given culture. It's not a process of just learning a few facts and then you're good to go, though that might be a helpful start. It's really a process of learning to work better with the individual. And I think for some people who don't like to talk about different cultures, or who are just kind of coming around to the idea of not always being in the majority culture, or not just assuming that because you're in the majority culture, you can take some relational aspects of your work with people for granted, just acknowledging that this is all a process of making your services better suited to what the client's needs are. So if that's easier for people to think about rather than thinking about it as culture, I guess you can, though I don't know why you'd want to make such a weird distinction. But hey, whatever is going to get you moving along so that you're working for the betterment of the client. So those are kind of the terms that we'll be discussing.
Good job. You did a nice job reviewing this.
I mean, I mostly took from other people who'd written extensively on this. It's not like something I've just pulled right off my head, but
yeah, and I like to put it in the context when we just talk about culture in the context of thinking about the levels of selection, right? So like going all the way back, and we talk about phylogenetic selection, which occurs at the genetic level across generations, ontogenic selection, which is the behavior that's learned in one's lifetime, is responsive to your own personal histories of reinforcement. And then you have cultural selection, so behavior that's been reinforced through the social process of the community that you live in. And it happens organically, just as all of the other behavior and reinforcement processes do. And that's how you end up with such varied, interesting, and distinct cultural practices around the world. I think it's fascinating, but it still adheres to the same behavioral principles as anything else, right? So it can be a process of reinforcement through social practices within a community, and that can be related to the religion of the community, but also the environment in which you live, right? So if there's certain foods that are present in that environment, then they're going to become part of your culture. If it's like really cold there, really hot there, like those are going to become components of that culture, and it all kind of gets baked in together and reinforced through the process of living in a certain place and as part of a certain community.
Mm-hmm.
When we took our coursework in behavior analysis, we didn't have a class on culture. And so it's up to us as behavior analysts, to go out and do that work ourselves, and also recognize that our code is generated from a Western culture, and it may not always align with the cultures that you're working with your families, right? So that's something that we need to really think about, is that our culture may, say one thing, and someone else's culture may say something else. And so the code isn't written to encompass all cultural norms. So take, for instance, the accepting or giving gifts, right? So this is a really common one that people talk about all the time, right? Mm-hmm. So in our code, it says that, we can accept gifts, and that could include anything, any sort of gift. So as small or big, the code doesn't specify what constitutes a gift. They do give a little more information about what constitutes gifts in the newsletter that corresponds to gift giving. But, when we talk about that, we say in a more concrete way, we shouldn't be accepting things from our families that we work with or our clients, because then it could represent a dual relationship. However, other cultures, not Western cultures, may view us not taking something that's offered as very offensive. And so that's not necessarily highlighted within the code. It's going to be important for us as supervisors and as people working with other cultures to recognize the complex nature of that and to be proactive when we're talking about these types of cultural differences as they relate to the code.
Yeah, so if we are only thinking about how we're going to provide care to our clients from our own perspective, then likely either that care is going to suffer or produce a poor outcome, or our relationship and the rapport that we can establish with that client is going to suffer. So what we're going to be sort of positing throughout this podcast is that it's important that we are culturally responsive from an ethical perspective, right? Like this should be something that is inherent within the care that we're providing to all of our families, that we're approaching it in a way that's going to be most meaningful for them. And that should be something that's kind of tied into the way that we think about the ethics of care that we're providing. And then, like Rob said, we're just going to layer on some extra easiness there by tying in the fact that if you've been around for a while, you're likely a supervisor in the field. And this should be something that's on, or not just on your radar, but like front and foremost in your thinking about how you're providing supervision for your students, your trainees, is that we need to be approaching it from this perspective of helping them to understand cultural responsiveness and how best to practice it within the behavior analytic clinical care.
Right. And it's actually very tough because until very recently, there had been a very little training provided for supervisors on, cultural responsiveness and cultural competence. So many times we had to look outside of our field in order to receive this training, which is good for professional development, right? But it may not count towards our learning credits. So that, shortens the time that we have. But, what I do love, and then I want to give a good shout out, is, we do now have more CEs that are available for cultural responsiveness. I wanted to give a shout out to the ABA task force and others that are providing learning credits around these very topics. So that's very exciting for us as behavior analysts, right? And another thing to think about is, when you look at the code, you don't really see cultural responsiveness or cultural competence in there a ton, right? So you see it highlighted in the code in 1.03, maintaining competence. And so what 1.03 says to us is that we have to maintain knowledge of current scientific and professional information. So we have to be doing that through conferences, conventions, participating in workshops. And that could, I'm stretching here, should involve cultural responsiveness, right? Because there is new things coming out all the time. And if we are working with people that are not from our culture or are from our culture, but we should be staying up to date on the literature of cultural responsiveness and how we can best serve our clients.
I mean, I don't know if I'd say that is a stretch, Jackie. I mean, especially when we look at the, huge, well, I don't know if it's huge, but certainly there is a solid body of research that looks at cases in which cultural variables are ignored and sort of, going from either the general findings that individuals from, the non-majority socioeconomic class, ethnic groups tend to have poorer outcomes of care, have poorer health overall, higher incidences of disabilities, as well as some like specific research that looked at failure to take into account the preferred or primary language of an individual actually impacting the results of something as simple as a functional analysis. I do think, when we are faced with this information, not keeping up with cultural responsiveness training, whether it's talks or workshops or role plays or whatever facet it is, you are really starting to go outside the bounds of good competence in working with various groups. And I suppose you could say, well, I only work with people of my exact ethnic group, with my exact learning history. But very few of us, I think, would choose to either choose directly to have that be our client base or be able to ever choose that as our client base. My only clients will be people just like me.
that's your focus, you might need to do some soul searching
Right.
there as well, right?
I mean, wherever the market is, I guess is where we're going to go, but reasonably.
And I know we kind of like started this off thinking about culture, or I presented the idea of culture as being like where you're from, but there's so many different aspects to culture. And like you said, Rob, so many different subcultures that many individuals belong to multiple cultures. So your culture could be related to your ethnicity, but also could be related to your gender, it could be related to your sexuality, it could be related to your religion, it could be related to a disability that you have, etc. And often more than one.
Yeah. There becomes the sad fact that as a field, we want people to be excited about behavior analysis the same way we're excited about behavior analysis. We already have a number of groups, whether we want to call them based on their culture, who don't care for our science or who have a different viewpoint of how the world works. But there are also going to be a number of individuals who, because they worked with caregivers who did not have training in appropriate cultural responsiveness techniques, they really just focused on how do I get the buy-in, not focused on how do I help my client the best way possible, might have had a terrible experience with other practitioners and are maybe hesitant to get services from another practitioner, which takes us to, other ethical concerns about providing meaningful services, evidence-based services to our clients. If you say, well, I don't want to learn about cultural responsiveness, and that costs you a client in the sense of they don't like working with you because you are clearly not taking their interests into account. Not only do you have the ethical failing of not working for your client or taking your client's needs and concerns into account, but now you also might be pushing them away from evidence-based research because they no longer want to work with anyone who's got B, C, B, or A after their job title.
It is difficult too, because one thing that I've noticed is that in other fields, cultural responsiveness is heavily laden in their ethical code, whereas in ours, it only specifically is referred to in 1.05C. And what that says is under professional and scientific relationships is where differences of age, gender, race, culture, ethnicity, national origin, religion, sexual orientation, disability, language, or socioeconomic status significantly affect behavior analyst work concerning particular individuals or groups, behavior analysts obtain the training, experience, consultation, and/or supervision necessary to ensure the competence of their services, or they make appropriate referrals.
One of the articles we're talking about tonight is from a nursing journal where there is a much more, I don't want to say it's a direct correlation, but I think there's much more of a research base looking at how poor cultural responsiveness can lead to poor medical outcomes, which again, if medical outcomes can be affected by cultural responsiveness, then everything would be. Those seem to be the most simple, like, well, of course, if, medical problems always seem like an A to B kind of a problem. And if even those can be impacted by poor cultural responsiveness, then any field in which you're helping other individuals is going to be severely impacted by a failure to take culture into account. People
may argue too that cultural responsiveness can be embedded in all of the guideline 3, 4, 5, and 7, but it's not directly stated, right? So we can't provide great assessment if we're not cultural responsive. We can't provide great intervention if we're not cultural responsive. So it's inherent, it's indirectly there, but it's not directly stated.
So let's get into some of the articles for tonight. So I think a theme that we're going to see in all these articles is the idea that learning about cultural responsiveness, teaching others about cultural responsiveness, thinking about cultural responsiveness from an ethical point of view is a skill, just like any other skill. And what's the theme of every single episode of this show? It's, well, just because you hear about a skill or want to practice a skill, you can't do it without some amount of learning, some amount of practice in a safe environment, some amount of mentorship with someone else, some amount of feedback on how you're doing the skill, and then engaging in that skill over and over and over with that feedback until you reach a component of fluency, and then even then continuing to learn more and more about it. So spoiler alert, if you thought there was going to be, and this is the article that tells you what to do, this doesn't really exist. Their articles are going to point you in the right direction. Now, again, in our field, I think there was a study by Bull Yu we've talked about previously looking at how ready are BCBAs to learn about culture or to engage in appropriate cultural competence skills. And, the good news of that article was in the survey that everyone feels that they can do cultural competence. They're ready for cultural competence. They think it's important to engage in cultural competence. The bad news is very few people actually have been trained in cultural competence, received feedback in cultural competence. So, to some extent, we are a field that is really excited to learn about cultural competence, but are not quite sure how we would engage in cultural competence, or potentially more dangerously, we seem to think we can engage in appropriate cultural competence without actually having been trained or supervised in cultural competence.
Yeah. And even the term cultural competence sort of has that same implication about it too, right? 'Cause it's like, all I need to do is learn some facts and then I'm going to be competent in all these other cultures, right? Which is really not something that one can do. You can learn about other cultures, but you can't really be competent in other cultures.
Be culturally mediocre.
Right? Like, I scored 100 on the quiz and now I know everything there is to know. Like the idea isn't even that you learn everything there is to know. It's just that you know what you don't know and then you know how to find out what you need to know for that particular family and client.
Mm-hmm. And I think some of the articles that we're discussing tonight go beyond some of the conversations we've had before about culture and cultural responsiveness, because they do get to the idea that learning about culture is not just, this is one skill that I have. I put it with my skill of preference assessment and behavior assessment, and I'll pull it out when I need it. It really should be something that we put into our worldview about how do we interact meaningfully with clients? How are we taking our clients' needs into account? And that's how I've more been thinking about cultural responsiveness as a component of how I am really trying to do right and do best for my client, which includes listening to my client, even if I think I might have the better answer that they disagree with. How do I work with them about that? And when I think about culture that way, it definitely becomes a skill that I would use throughout all of my practice, rather than like, looks like this family's from another culture. I better do what's right as someone who's not from that culture and read the book about it and then, learn some factoids about it. Because that I think is as we're going to talk about, really a very surface level of learning about other cultures. So that really would be the cultural competence point of the cultural responsiveness. Like, I'm kind of understand It's a thing, and I do a little bit. I do that surface level work to make them feel at home because they're different than me, and I have to make sure they understand me because my culture is more important. So really thinking of culture as other rather than culture as an important component of any individual's learning history. So I'm going to start off by talking about the Munoz article. And I really enjoyed this article in terms of, man, I wish this sort of a program existed when I was in graduate school, because it would have saved me not a lot of problems down the road, but I think it would save me from feeling like, how am I going to learn all of the things I need to learn, on my own? Anyone who's still in graduate school listening to this, please make sure, learn as much as you can while you still have teachers surrounding you to make sure that you don't totally mess everything up. Because once you're outside of that, you can still keep learning and should keep learning, but you lose a little bit of that safety net that's always kind of nice to have.
It's a less curated experience.
Yeah, exactly. So in this article, there is a review of a pilot program for how could we train graduate students to engage in better cultural responsiveness. And, again, wouldn't it have been nice if this had been something from day one that our professors had put into all aspects of our classwork, our programming? So you learned about behavior assessment, culture was a component of that. You learned about skill acquisition, culture was a component of that. Because so much of what we're sort of learning after the fact nowadays, and we're trying to build a level of fluency, just would have developed that fluency. It would have been a lot of work, but it wouldn't have noticed the work. Because again, you're students, you just do what your professors tell you back then, right?
Yeah. And just to keep in mind, like, behavior analysis is a young field, and it has until very recently been a very small field as well. So when you compare that to the size and expansiveness and history of nursing, they've had a lot longer to build these types of programs. That's not to give excuses for behavior analysts, because I think we are behind schedule for this, but there are a lot of people now who are rapidly working on trying to get everything up to speed.
Mm-hmm. So in the course that Munoz and colleagues developed, this was a course in a human services college for nursing students, social workers, and educators. So not for behavior analysts specifically, though, again, I think a lot of the components would fit right into what graduate level student in behavior analysis would want to work on. And it really looked at how can we make focusing on social justice, on client rights, specifically in terms of aspects of learning about client cultures, a component of all of the work that we are doing. And so this course was much more individual focused. It was more on teaching the practitioner the steps required to become more responsive to others from different cultures. So it really had a nice focus in the individual understanding where they were in sort of the hierarchy of learning about culture. Some caveats to this study was they really were looking at, it was a pilot program, so they don't have a lot of data to talk about how effective it was. A lot of social validity results were taken in this study. And also it was a school that already had its social justice as a part of their mission, and they really wanted that to be a component of all of their curricula. So this wasn't something that just, super out of touch university decided to throw together and wow, it was super effective. Like you would need to be going into a school that actually wanted this to be a component of their mission. This isn't something you can just kind of throw together, over the weekend with a colleague. The program itself followed a model that I really liked reading about by Campina Bacote. And Campina Bacote has 5 components of cultural competence in delivering specifically healthcare, though again, I think these are 5 components that would be good in any field. And the idea is you sort of move through the levels of cultural competence, starting with cultural awareness. So you start with the idea of, deliberately appreciating and being sensitive that there are other cultures with different values of their clients. And a lot of the work is on understanding your own cultural beliefs, values, and practices, because by understanding what your own culture is, you can better identify when your culture, what your culture is and how it might not always be the same culture of everyone around you. Moves into cultural knowledge. That's kind of the second phase. And that's really that educational piece. So this is where I am learning how to gather cultural information about others. I'm learning about other worldviews. I'm learning about other culture value systems and other beliefs, which can include their beliefs regarding health, childcare would also be important, and human development. After that, you'd move into the cultural skill level. So this is where you not only have learned about and understand your own culture, but you're starting to collect relevant cultural data by interviewing other individuals, figuring out what's pertinent to a history based on, that lens of culture, what cultural context might be playing a role in the behavior of an individual, and then understanding how there are different communication styles and meanings across cultures. So this is, again, the part where you're starting to work with other individuals from different cultures. This moves into the 4th stage, which is the cultural encounters stage. And this is where the individual is starting to look for more opportunities to engage in cross-cultural interactions. And it finally finishes with the cultural desire stage, where there's a real commitment and motivation of the professional to continue to provide care that is taking culture into account, that is accepting of other cultures, appreciates differences in other cultures, and can really just take all the information about culture that they are given from their client and sort of take it into the consideration in all aspects of their work. So it's sort of that synthesis of the whole level. And in this course, they really wanted to follow this model. So they sort of also, they looked at this and then they used a really neat kind of an observation tool. It was a test of intercultural sensitivity, the intercultural development inventory. So it's an assessment of your intercultural sensitivity. And it sort of looked at where you are in this kind of scale that read to me a lot like kind of the stages of grief, like that was the pop psychology kind of, when you grieve, you go through these stages. Sort of thinking about culture as going through different stages. So your first stage of learning about other cultures is that you deny that there's a difference between you and other cultures. So you don't interact with people from other cultures. You engage in a lot of benign stereotyping. You might make statements like, I think it's important that we all get along no matter our culture, but you're not really invested in any sort of learning about other cultures or accepting that other cultures are anything but not you. They're different than you. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of that first stage. And then it sort of moves through those stages up to the last stage, which is the integration of different stage, where, again, like you can integrate that there are other cultures around you. You can understand them. You've learned about them. You can learn more about them by interacting with other people. You're actively engaging in this process. And then it's sort of a part of all your frames of reference. So you're taking it into account almost without thinking about it. So again, what we think of as sort of fluency in this skill. And so that was the assessment they used. So how far in these stages from that denial up to the integration of differences did the students move, as well as questions like, hey, kids, did you like the class? Sort of how they assessed this class. And it was a 7-week course. It met 2 hours per week. They really focused on topics like, how do we define cultural competence? How do we identify our scope in our relevant academic disciplines? So again, it was either nursing, education, or social work in regards to culture. And then really critically thinking about the role of culture in the practice. It had, they had a lot of readings, they had written responses, they did some role play activities, they interacted with guest speakers who were specifically brought in by professors to talk about cultural experiences different than that of the students. They had a lot of class discussion, opportunities for personal reflection of incidents that had occurred in their work week. So in that way, I think, we kind of think about it as maybe like your group supervision or your individual supervision kind of a meeting. And then at the end of the class, they sort of looked, and again, they weren't expecting the students to go from like, oh, they really hated other cultures to, wow, they're fluent in working with people from different backgrounds. But they did find, looking at their questionnaire or their assessment, that the students had moved from that initial stage of like defense against difference, or maybe a stage where they minimized differences. So they focused on what's the same about all of us? Like, we're all people on this crazy blue planet, into a slightly more advanced stage so that they accepted there was a difference, or were starting to learn how to adapt to differences of others. And of course, all the students, they said very positive things about the class. They felt it was very helpful. They hadn't really thought about many of these issues before. They thought it was going to be very important in their jobs going forward. So again, a class like this might not be a bad idea. So again, if you are in a graduate program, so you're teaching in a graduate program, or you are maybe entering, I know we do have a lot of listeners who have just entered a graduate program. This might be something that, if you're able to access, would be an excellent start. But for many of us, not always going to be a component that we can access readily. We're probably going to have to do a lot of our learning outside of the classroom environment, more workshops, or hopefully with some of the other strategies that we'll be discussing in our articles. So anyway, that would be great if you were still a student. Why don't we take a quick break, and then when we come back, Jackie and Diana, I know you have some great articles to discuss that will get a little bit more into how we can continue learning this skill.
Oh, just you wait, Rob.
Oh, I will. I hope you all wait too. We'll be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu. See you there!
And we are back talking about the ethics of teaching cultural responsiveness. But before we get back into the back half of our articles, I want to remind all of our listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE approved. By listening to this episode, you're able to earn 1 ethics learning credit. That's right, folks. We didn't put ethics in the title just for fun. This is an episode about ethics, and therefore you can earn 1 learning credit for your ethics requirements. Now, you're going to need to finish listening to the episode, of course. Then you'll need to go to our website, abainsidetrack.com/get-CEUs. That's GET-CEUS. And you're going to need to enter in some information, including 2 code words that we put in this episode. The first one is Dickens. D-I-C-K-E-N-S. You know, like that classic expression, what the dickens? I'm pretty sure every culture uses that one, right? That's a popular one across all cultures. What the dickens?
I say it a lot.
Everyone says that. Or maybe Charles Dickens, the author.
Never heard of him.
Never heard of him?
Mm-mm.
Well, some cultures really like his long-winded, old-timey prose.
I took an entire class on Bleak House.
Ugh.
1 book. Whole class.
I just need my Mickey's Christmas Carol. That's all the Charles Dickens I need.
Dive. Dickens.
All right. Let's get back to the show. So, Diana, you also read an article and are going to share an article about, continuing that work of learning about cultural responsiveness. So please tell us what you've learned.
Okay, I will do that. My article was the Rogers, Siren, and Siren article, and it was from 2009, and I
didn't read like a 2009
I know.
article.
I felt it felt very fresh and current for me, but it's over 10 years old now. And I don't know what the process of change has been in the education setting, which is where this article is from. But it felt like I mean, I'll get into the details, but it feels like things that could and should occur now for our field. Mm-hmm. And I was surprised that it was as old as it was. So I am glad that we went outside of our current literature. We have not done an exhaustive review of all the behavior analytic articles on this topic, but we're getting close to that. So I was excited to kind of branch out, and we have Rob's article that was from the nursing category, and then this article, which was from Journal of Diversity in Higher Education specifically, but it was about education teachers, so public school teachers. But again, I think that there was a lot of content here that was highly relevant for practitioners and clinicians of behavior analysis. They start their article off reviewing things that are not surprising to us, but are the kind of things that we've reviewed before here. And they mostly just harken back to the importance of teaching, well, in this case, it's teachers, how to work with individuals from other cultures and why that's so important. So they worded really, really nicely to say something that wasn't really that nice, which was that there was a quote unquote mismatch of cultures in schools, with many teachers not representing the culture of their students. And that this may lead teachers to easily misread the intents and capabilities of their students due to cultural and language style differences, right? So what they're really saying is teachers may be stereotyping their students or placing inappropriate expectations or lowered expectations on students based on their culture or the style of representation. And this is obviously unfair to students. So they're saying something that I thought they worded it well, but still pointed out that this is a very big concern. They went on further to say that the expectations for teachers may be contributing to widening the achievement gap that you do see in schools, which if anyone's unfamiliar, you do see an achievement gap between typically white and Asian students and Black and Latinx students. And they say that obviously this is something that needs to be closed. We need to figure out how to make sure that that's occurring. And they said that for teachers, it's possible that the teachers may have some internalized racism that they're bringing into the picture. If they have different expectations for the students, that may result in a different quality of education. It may be that if the teachers have different expectations, that could lead to internalized different performance expectations on the part of the students, or that the students may have what's called like a stereotype threat, which means, and I'm going to put this in quotes to make sure I got it right, being at risk of confirming as a self-characteristic a negative stereotype about one's group. Mm-hmm. And that was a quote that they quoted from someone else named Steele and Aronson.
And that was the example in the article they used was study of undergraduate students where if they just said, I'm going to give you all a test, and you had sort of white and Black participants, everyone did about the same on the test. But when they said something like, I'm going to give you an intelligence test, the Black students performed lower, even though it was the same test in both settings. So that idea of, depending on phrasing that is used, that many of us would think is innocuous, it can impact the performance of individuals from certain cultural types.
Yeah, thank you. That's super helpful. And obviously that's sad and not what we want to have happening in any way, shape, or form. So the whole point of that introduction was just saying, like, we have to figure out how to fix this, right? And one of the ways that we should be fixing this is, can we start by teaching teachers what to do with regard to recognizing how this is problematic in their communities and in their schools, and teaching whatever type of appropriate, they called it diversity training. I do think that term is kind of, we've moved past that term, right? So whatever type of cultural competence or responsiveness training needs to occur. So not that these have never been done before, but they took their own spin on it. And I like what they came up with. So they devised this like 1-day workshop that hit a lot of really good points. And what they were doing in their workshop, they decided to call the REST kit, which REST stood for racial and ethical sensitivity training, and KIT just stood for KIT.
It's like a box. You just open it up and all the answers.
I was like, but KIT is in all caps. You're like, doesn't KIT also stand for something? But no.
Knight Industries 2000.
No, it's not.
It's a car from Knight Rider. He did. If the car from Knight Rider did this training, oh boy, sign me up.
They call it a workshop because they said they wanted to try to create something that could easily be distributed to others so that other people could do this type of training as well. And they pointed out that there's a lot of similarities to what they were doing to what had been done before, because a big focus of this workshop was to develop awareness, knowledge, and skills related to diversity/cultural responsiveness. But there was something that was quite different about this. And this is, of course, why we picked this article. It's because this is different than other types of trainings, because what they were doing here was anchored in professional ethics and this was specifically for educators. But again, let's practice some generalization and think about how we could apply this to behavior analysts. So they were going to, talk about all of these components of, anti-racism in the classroom, but how can we do so in the context of ethical principles for the field, and how those can be applied and should be applied to issues related to stereotyping, discrimination, neglect, etc. And I will say a lot of this article was focused on racial discrimination. But again, we could do that type of generalization again and think about sort of larger pictures of types of cultural diversity as well. And so, we already had the nice acronym, right? REST KIT. They buried the lead here, though, because REST KIT was actually based on the ethics work of a man named James Rest, published in 1983, who apparently these two folks love, right? They're like, we love James Rest, we love his work, we love his 4 ethical components. Let's design an entire workshop around it and create an acronym specifically based on his last name that we will name our workshop.
It's amazing.
I love it. It's so meta.
James Rest was like, wow, I'm impressed, everyone.
Right? I know.
So it was a bit of a backronym in that regard. They're like, we got to call it the REST something.
Is that what it's called when you have that acronym first and you...
Yeah, then you make up.
It's called a backronym?
I don't know. They didn't say it was a backronym in the study. I'm guessing that that's what they did. But the fact that they wanted to be based on the work of James
clearly.
Rest, I would guess that they went with the REST and then went back and said, well, how can we do racism and ethic and training? Thank goodness. We got 3 out of 4 right off the bat.
KIT. I just never heard backronym before.
Mm-hmm.
Now I know.
Now you
know. That's
know.
amazing. I'm going to use that from now on. Okay, but they picked a good one because I liked what he did based on what I read about it from this article, at the very least. So James Rest's ethical system had 4 components for moral decision-making. I will tell you what those are now. Component number 1 was ethical sensitivity. And they defined this as the identification of the salient ethical aspects of the situation. And I was like, my ears perked up. I was like, salient, that's the word I use, right? I like it. Component number 2 was moral judgment. This was defined as formulating the morally ideal course of action through reasoning. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're going to lay out some actionable potential steps.
And that's the tricky step in using the ethics code, as we talked about in our great ethics debate, which either is coming out
We haven't talked about that yet.
We haven't. Well, we talked about it. It's coming out. It's coming out next week.
Next week. Yes. And this was, if we're going to talk about that, then this is a moral decision-making model, right? So it's more of a values-based model. Component number 3 is moral motivation, which they defined as having necessary motivation to act in an ethical manner. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's another word that we like to use too. Mm-hmm. And then component 4 is moral action, which was defined as having the moral character to execute and implement what ought to be done. So again, we have some action steps there too. So I was like, okay. I think I like this. I appreciate what's going on here, because basically Dr. Rest has taken these steps of moral decision-making and broken them down into observable and measurable components. Mm-hmm. And we basically have a little TA here for what needs to happen in order to incorporate your ethical perspective into your decision-making process when faced with an ethical dilemma. And I was like, hot dog. I think I like it. So that was the background. That's what our power couple here, Rogers, Siren, and Siren, wanted to do in their workshop. And then they told us exactly how they did it. And they told us how they did it in an amazing level of detail, which I truly appreciated. But I'm going to go through it quickly. So we had 95 pre-service teachers who participated in this study. They ran workshops all year long. I think they did 10 of them. They were each one-day workshops. They were 5 to 12 participants in a workshop at a time. Most of them were like finishing up grad school, basically. And they looked at a test pre and post that tested them on these ethical sort of scenarios and whether they could identify those scenarios and kind of to what depth, basically. So they had a pre-post survey that self-reported on multicultural awareness, and that was called the TMAS, Teacher Multicultural Competence Scale. So they did that one. And then they also did another one pre-post called the Quick REST. Again, REST was racial and ethical sensitivity test, but this was just the quick version. Mm-hmm. It wasn't the kit. It was the survey that they did at the beginning and the end, done by yours truly, the authors. They were the authors of this little survey. What it really consisted of there were 2 5-minute video vignettes, one called Faculty Lounge and one called Basketball Practice. And within each of them, there were 8 to 10 ethical dilemmas or violations fit into this 5-minute video. Most of them, they did note, were related to racial discrimination. So in order to take the quick REST test, you watched one of the 2 videos, and then they had 18 questions that were designed to determine if you recognize the ethical violations that were within the videos. And what they did is they had some of the participants do Faculty Lounge at the beginning and basketball practice at the end, and then some of them do it the other way around so that they had that counterbalanced.
I would love to see these videos.
I know, me too.
That is a lot of ethical dilemma and racial discrimination, like packed into one 2-minute video, right?
Right? Yeah.
You guys want to hear something? I looked up this lab and I actually emailed the author to see if we could get copies of the videos. And unfortunately, I did it right before the holidays, so I have not heard back. I'm not actually sure if this is still an area of research, but I'm hoping to hear back in the future.
I would love to.
If we can get a copy or even like a sample of some of these, I would definitely love to share them so people kind of see what they are, because this is one of the few, I think, teaching skill courses around race and ethical sensitivity where there is a product that is going to sort of capture the interaction that you're hoping to see improvement on. Whereas many of the others, I think they sort of just, we talked about it, or we thought, what could I do in the situation? Which again, very helpful, but not quite, I think, might not have the same impact as, look, here's a situation, give this person feedback. And by giving them feedback, you will hopefully then be able to reflect on your own behavior in similar situations in the future.
Right, because you can only talk about what you should do for so long. Yeah. Right? And
you have to do it.
You run into that in the literature too. You read all these articles about what people should do, and you're like, but has anyone done it? Has anyone actually done anything yet? Yeah. So I liked it for that reason too, is they actually got in there and did it. I would love to see these videos.
I'll share them if I hear a response back.
And they say that you can share them.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I would really love to see. I mean, they're probably not dated yet, right? Although what I didn't mention is that you can, or if you attended this workshop, you could win an MP3 player.
Wow, like a Zune?
Yeah, I think so.
Wow.
So that's definitely
iPod Shuffle?
Yeah.
I have one of those.
Somewhere, right?
No,
in a drawer somewhere.
No, I still use it.
What?
Really?
Yeah, you guys forgot who I am. I have no electronic equipment. And yeah, I still use it all the time.
Oh. Yeah, so they did that. So they did that multicultural competence scale. Then they did the video where they answered the questions about the videos. And then they did a social validity survey at the end of the workshop as well. Mm-hmm. And then they laid out for us what they did in the workshop. So it was a day-long workshop. And I'm going to just go through a little bit of the process because I think that it would be helpful for listeners to kind of hear the structure of this. So this is what they did. They had started the morning off with some icebreakers. They did say that breakfast and lunch were provided in addition to the option to win the MP3 player. So it was a pretty sweet deal. But of course, you got to start things off with some icebreakers. And then the day was broken up into mini lectures, videos, and discussions and / role plays, basically. So there were components of behavioral skills training here, but of course it was not called that, but it did have several of those pieces. So they had a mini lecture on the rationale. Then they had people discuss whether they had either experienced or witnessed discrimination in the workplace. They had a mini lecture on the training philosophy and these 6 principles that they had found when they looked at various different educational ethics codes. Pieces of these were present in all of the codes. So they kind of pointed out that these were the important things that everyone already agreed on that should be taught related to culture, which were professional competence, integrity, professional and scientific integrity, respect for others' rights and dignity, concern for others' welfare, and social responsibility. So no one's really going to disagree, I think, with any of those. And then they had everyone watch one of these, what they called REST videos. In the video, there were 5 videos throughout the workshop, and each of them depicted an ethical violation. And they did note that these were professionally written scripts and actors and directors. So like they had a grant to get this done, I think. So presumably they were of decent quality. And in the first video, they had everyone just watch the ethical violation and then try to identify what the violation was. Then there was a mini lecture where they reviewed James Rest's model of moral decision-making, those 4 points that I already told you. Then they had a discussion about the internal and external barriers to action that might be in place related to speaking up about discrimination. They watched another video. This time, after the video, they discussed the ethical violations that were there, but now also potential courses of action that one could take. So they're kind of building upon that. Then they had a discussion about future professional roles for these educators, responsible and harmful ways to handle power, and resources that would be available to those with little power within that system. They watched another video. Now they talked about what the characters might be thinking, what barriers they're facing, and the power dynamics involved. Next, it was time for a mini lecture on the skills that were needed to handle racism and discrimination in schools. And these were communication skills, community building skills, and self-care skills. Then they practiced assertive communication after deciding that that was the best type of communication to use. And then they watched a presentation on community building skills, collective and individual action. They learned about self-care, and then they did their post-test at the end of the day, which was either the faculty lounge or the basketball practice. They did that again. And now results, these were just statistical results. I was like, come on, man, like at least give me a scatter plot or something. But no, we didn't get that. So all we know based on the data or that they did a t-test and that results were statistically significantly higher for the quick rest following training than they were previously.
So we know this course at least teaches you how to watch videos similar to other videos you've already seen and identify, but different, and identify sources of discrimination. Which again, that's important. I mean, I think a lot of problems with discrimination are, can you always tact when discrimination is occurring if you're not actively looking for the relevant cues related to them? Because many of them are going to be very subtle, if not, more private events than they are, outward behavior necessarily. Not always, certainly, but
right. I mean, it's hard to try to capture everything that they worked on in the workshop in a post-test, right? But at least they did attempt it, and it wasn't just the like self-report data as well. So it was objective with regard to the video. And they also did some pretty extensive social validity follow-up with everyone. So the participants listed the training as very effective. They felt they could apply what they had learned. 95% said they would recommend the training. 60% thought that the discussion part of the training was most helpful. And 80% said they enjoyed the role plays, which, if you've ever been in a workshop, the role plays is the part everyone hates the most. Yeah. Because everyone's so self-conscious. So, if 80% said they liked them, that was, pretty good.
Can I share my favorite quote from the article?
Yes.
They said, when talking about social validity responses, quote, another blatantly asked, why is this not mandatory? End quote.
Very fair. That might be something that comes up in the dissemination station as well, right? They suggested that the training should be mandatory. So overall, they got good results in the way that they were looking at them. But I really liked the study because it tied in. It wasn't just like, these are the things you should do to try to reduce discrimination in schools or in the classroom. It was like, let's think about this from the perspective of that you're going to be an educator, right? And these are your ethical responsibilities as an educator, and providing that type of framework and model for people to work from in order to figure out what to do in the future when they encounter these types of situations. So for me, it fits really nicely into our discussion of ethics. It also allows us a lot of ways to think about how we might map on what they did here to the types of training I think that are quite necessary that we do for our BACB trainees moving forward.
All right. And Jackie, let's keep the ball rolling. You read the article by Sellers and colleagues, we all read them, but you will be sharing.
This one doesn't necessarily talk about cultural responsiveness or cultural competence, so I made a little bit of a stretch here when we're talking about this article. This article specifically talks about supervision, and supervision is 100% necessary for the increased cultural responsiveness of our field. that's kind of how we're going to tie it all together, right? Because we all know that it's likely when you start your supervision practices, they're going to be fairly similar to what your supervisor did, right? So most of the time, this is what you see. And if your supervisor didn't talk about cultural competence, then you may not talk about cultural competence, at least initially with your supervisees. So then it comes into this, what I like to call a vicious cycle, right? So it's really important that we, as supervisors, try to incorporate cultural responsiveness for both our clients and our supervisees when we're trying to tackle the bigness of supervision. And so when I get to this part of the ethical code, this is guideline 5, I start, no lie, getting like little sweaty, and my palms get a little like hot, because when we are functioning as supervisors, we take full responsibility for all facets of what's going on, right? So what the client is doing, what our supervisees are doing, even if we're not there. Isn't that scary?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? And so just thinking about that when you say, oh yeah, I'm going to supervise this person, everything they do job related is under you, right? So you're taking full responsibility for what that supervisee is doing at all parts of their job. And so that's why supervision is so important. And talking about cultural responsiveness and talking about how you're going to deal with really complex cultural scenarios is vital when we're talking about supervision. So this article really wants to talk about each of the ethical codes as they relate to supervision and specific supervision issues. And here, I am going to make the jump that if we don't talk about the cultures of our supervisees or our clients, it's detrimental in creating interventions that will be effective for both our clients and our supervisees, and our interventions may not maintain in strength, right? If they're not contacting naturally occurring reinforcers in the environment in which we want them to be. They also want to talk about all of the different challenges that come with supervision and how we might, as supervisors, lay out a really strong foundation for our supervisees. And so it's important to note that supervision as a behavior analyst can be twofold, right? So one could be supervising a clinical case, but it also could be that of a supervisee. And so this article specifically talks about that of a supervisee, right? And so I'm going to make the claim that the supervisee doesn't have to be a BCBA in training, doesn't have to be an RBT. I think anyone that is in our field should have the same sort of supervision that those people that are trying to get advanced degrees should. Do you guys agree with me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it doesn't specifically state that in the ethical code. It says, those people that are getting their BCBA or their RBT, or those that are starting graduate work. But I'm going to argue that everyone that is engaging in behavior analytic work should be relying on our codes. And so there are 7 codes here. And so the first code is 5.01, and this code says that you should supervise only within your defined area of competence. And so here we can and we should argue that cultural competence is critical for working with our supervisees, right? So, and how we are communicating information, how we are giving them feedback, how they're going to be giving us feedback is going to be really important when we take into cultural considerations. So it should be the responsibility of the BCBA and not the supervisee to learn about various cultural contexts and to practice working with others from different backgrounds as theirs, right? So I like to think about this, how to talk to others that are not like you, right? So it's not the supervisee's responsibility to teach the BCBA about their culture. I think that's really important. It's the BCBA's responsibility to learn how to talk to a lot of different people, right? So no one should be like, oh, so you're from this specific culture. How do you like feedback, right? Or how does everyone in your culture like feedback?
Jay, you're talking specifically here about working with a supervisee from a different culture.
Yep, absolutely.
Correct. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, you shouldn't be, trying to use one person to generalize from an entire culture, right? Nobody likes being that person. I was that person one time when I lived in England for a while, and I was taking a class on Shakespeare, and they called me out and they're like, so as an American, how do you feel about this specific text? And I was like, I don't know. Right? Like, as me, this is how I feel, but I don't think I can tell you that everyone in America would say the same thing in this one instance.
Did you just like drink some beer and then like burp real out and go, America? And then everyone just assumed that's what all Americans thought about Shakespeare?
Actually, I don't remember what happened. I think I might have stammered a ton.
I saw that movie with Mel Gibson.
Right?
Yeehaw!
I'm not sure what I did there. I can't actually remember. I think I might have turned really red and looked like I was going to throw up. And so I moved on. I think that's what probably happened. But yeah, and I know I said it earlier, but I want to kind of highlight again, this code was developed in a predominantly Western context, and it contains rules that may appear to be at odds with some groups. So this is specifically referenced on 301. And I think this is important to state, right? So our code may not always align with the cultures that we're working with. And so it's going to be important for us as supervisors to relay that information to our supervisees. And so I'm going to read right from the article. They say the code was not developed by those cultures, and therefore some cultural negotiation and communication may be in order. Given that these situations are varied and complex, the critical thing that a supervisor can do is to help supervisees learn to identify potentially difficult situations and engage in thoughtful and critical problem solving. Similarly, if a family member maintains a particular method of daily repeated prayers that is not shared by the supervisees, the supervisor should be in a skilled position to help educate the supervisee as to how to accommodate the family practices into treatment in a way that is accepting and not judgmental. When I read that, I was like, ooh, I wrote in my notes, this bears repeating. Right? I didn't want to paraphrase that because I think that little paragraph tells us that, right? So we need to be considering the culture and the context in which we're working in. We need to be non-judgmental. We need to be open, right? And we need to take responsibility for our own actions as a supervisor.
I think that's a very good point in terms of the overall work of teaching our supervisees how to problem solve. I think Lara Turner, talked a lot about teaching problem solving to
Sophie Turner?
Sophie Turner?
No, I'm just kidding.
No, stop it. Now you're confusing me. Don't do that. It's probably mad enough at me as it is for getting her name wrong last time. But I've done a lot of work on problem solving. And I think this is a great problem solving skill. You need to teach your supervisee. You have to follow these ethical codes. You also need to know when you might not be able to follow these ethical codes, which is hard enough, for a practitioner, but it's got to be so hard for your supervisee. But the main skill, like you said, Jackie, is what are the key components at play here? What are the components of this ethical decision-making you need to go into? How does culture play into it? What pieces of culture might you not be taking into account in coming to the optimal ethical problem-solving, culturally responsive solution? Which is, really easy, I'm sure. Everyone could do that.
Right. But I think this is important, right? Because as supervisors, we have to teach the code and we have to remind our supervisees that they have to follow the code. But along that same line, we have to be mindful that we're not always going to, in every instance, 100% be like, well, this is what the code says, so this is what I've got to do, right? And those types of skills are hard to come by and they take practice, right? So that's where, behavioral skills training is going to be coming in to play. That's where we're going to be having to talk a lot about different ethical scenarios around culture. And we're going to get there soon in 5.04, which is designing effective supervision training. And then, they talk about 5.02, which is like your volume of supervision. So basically here you only can take what you can hold, right? You only can take what you can hold within your schedule. And that's going to be important too for you to recognize that you're going to have to teach each supervisee individually on how to problem solve within these cultural contexts, right? And I know that when someone's like, hey, I really need a supervisor, please help me. You might want to just say, sure. But what we've found is that when supervisors are taking more supervisees than they can handle, right? Quality goes down. You don't really have a lot of one-on-one time that you might need. You might be missing things, which will lead to a breakdown in our field. And that volume here speaks volumes about talking, having the time to sit down and have these conversations, because they're not going to be 15 minutes, right? It's not going to be one of those 15-minute chats. We're like, okay, let's talk about culture, right? That usually doesn't lend itself to a quick little chat. And if you have a lot of supervisees, you may be doing them a disservice because you don't have that time and space to give them the proper, outlets to have these discussions. The next one they talk about is 5.03 Supervisory Delegation. And what this ethical code states is really don't give a supervisee a task that they're not comfortable or have the skills to do, right? So part of supervision is to identify the skills supervisees can do, as well as what supervisors cannot do, and work on those skills that may help with increasing their skill set, right? So this article suggests that we create a list of do's and don'ts and practice those using behavioral skills training. And I think stretching to cultural responsiveness, this might be a great place where we can come up with varying levels of cultural context in which supervisees may be exposed to, from a very simple situation to a very complex situation, right? And have them respond to these different scenarios to help and enhance cultural responsiveness in these situations, right? And I do, I teach an ethics class, and when we talk about cultural responsiveness in the class, the students are like, oh, why are we doing these examples? Like, why are we talking about them? This is not what happens in real life. And then they get into real life and they're like, oh my gosh, remember when we practiced that? And you said this is going to happen to you. And I said, no, it's not. And then it did. Right? So, and I always feel like a little bit like, yeah, I told you. But I don't say that most of the time, because ethics comes up in our everyday, in our everyday work. And it's important to practice those particularly challenging situations in a place that's safe, right? And it is a place that isn't going to jeopardize the relationship with your client or your supervisees. So here in this supervisory delegation, I think this is a great place where you can start giving more and more responsibility to your supervisees when they've demonstrated those prerequisite skills of cultural responsiveness. Yeah, so 5.04 is my favorite one of this, where it's talking about designing effective supervision and training. We as supervisors have to be up to date on the literature. So I wanted to ask you guys, what are you doing to keep you up to date on the supervision literature?
I do a podcast on behavior analytic research every week that requires me to read multiple articles.
I teach the entire practicum series for our verified course sequence at work.
That is so true.
I mean, my answer...
I've recently stripped the entire thing down and built it back up from the ground.
Yeah, my answer was kind of flip, but I mean, I've always liked supervision and training. So for me, anytime I see an article in Java or someone mentions an article or there's a webinar on supervision, I tend to just jump on it and then write down the citations and then print them out and then read them later on. So I have a stack. There's supervision, I keep near my desk and I'll like pull one out every now and again or when I've got downtime. So
Rob's really a lifelong learner.
He really is.
He really is, though. Yeah.
One thing that I find really helpful is I make myself have a table of contents alert to my favorite behavior analytic journals. Mm-hmm. So every month or whenever the issues come out, I get a little email. It's like, ooh, look what's coming up. And then I can like peruse it. And then if I feel like I want to read one of those articles, then I can go find it or put it in my must read list. So that's one thing that I do besides, working in the field and doing this podcast as well. So here's another question for you then. How are you trying to incorporate cultural responsiveness into your supervisory style now? Because both of you supervise people.
I tend to focus on the problem-solving kind of component of cultural competence because, depending on who my supervisees are at any given time, they may not have a client who is from a different culture. So sometimes it can be hard to do anything other than like, let's talk about stereotypes or let's talk about some examples of, which can be helpful, I find, but, they don't always stick with a supervisee because they're trying to get through the day as well most of the time. So a lot of times I focus more on the listening, acknowledging what's different, acknowledging one's own culture, and then thinking about how, there could be bias that they weren't planning to put into their work with an individual. So being very client focused in that regard, that's typically how I focus my time. Unless they do, again, have a client who is from a different culture, in which case, we try to be a little bit more in depth with what do we need to learn about? What should we be taking into account? What questions might we not have asked that we now definitely should be asking? because sometimes they're a little different than sort of generic problem-solving questions.
I have a bevy of articles that I pull from for this purpose, and I also present scenarios to them quite often that involve interpreting things through a cultural lens, and we always have that as part of the conversation. And then what I think that I think that all that's valuable, and I think many of them are like very, very ready for that conversation. And then the other thing that I've been incorporating is that when I talk about culture, I also talk about thinking about neurodiversity perspectives as part of different cultures too, and pulling that in. So having everyone reflect on whether the goals that they're thinking of are something that's part of the neurotypical culture, right? And how it would be received as part of a larger culture that may be more neurodiverse, and whether it still remains as a good goal. So we've been having those types of conversations a lot as well. And that's been, I think, really important and appropriately challenging. And we've all grown through that process.
I know I have grown through just listening to you and talking to you about it.
Oh, thanks, girl.
Yeah, no problem.
Wait, which one of us?
Both of you. More so Diana, just because I talked to her more about this, but right. But I think it's important to have these discussions, because I'm not going to tell you a lie that this is something that I've always thought about, because it's not, and it should be, right? So,
well, we've all been trying to teach ourselves.
Yeah.
Right. Because this is new, and it's so important. And I think, as we go through these articles, like, I get a little pit in my stomach, and then I'm like, okay, like, we have to keep doing better and doing more. And how can we make sure that we're like better preparing the future of our field and trying to steady our course and make sure that we're on the right direction. And that's our responsibility as, senior behavior analysts now in the field.
And educators, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that I might be the least. I have to learn more than Rob and Diana have been doing a much better job than I have been doing, I think.
I don't think so.
But I've been trying to put myself in uncomfortable situations so that I can learn more and I can make myself vulnerable. But I think we all need to do that, right? So
yeah,
we all need to get out there and get uncomfortable so that we can grow.
Mm-hmm.
And that really brings me into 5.05. But Rob, you wanted to say something?
Oh, I was going to say, if it makes you feel any better, Jackie, I think sometimes I'm just oblivious to the fact I'm in an uncomfortable situation and just barrel ahead with my good intentions.
That happens too, right?
That's true. Not ideal. I'm mostly kidding there, though. I'm sure I've dodged some uncomfortable situations simply by not acknowledging that they were uncomfortable situations.
Right.
Well, awareness of the self is step number 1.
Yep.
I'm still working on that. I'll get there someday.
Use Fong. Yeah.
Fong 2016. So actually that really, leads us really nicely into talking about Guideline 5.05, which is one that I think is written for the students, right? So the 5.05 is the communication of supervision conditions. This is where students can get a written breakdown of conditions under which supervision will and will not occur for both the supervisor and the supervisee, right? So if a student or a supervisee, right, is in a position where they're not feeling that their supervision is meeting their expectations, this is when this is so vital to have, right? Because this is where you can say like, oh, it's not your fault. I'm just looking at our conditions that we wrote out, and this is the things that we haven't been doing. Here are specific examples. How can we fix this, right? And I think this one is key for anyone that maybe feels that they need to have more discussion on cultural awareness and cultural responsivity, right? In context, because this is where you can advocate for yourself to have that right here under this communication of supervision conditions. So I like that one a lot. I wrote in big, huge notes, advocate for yourself in huge block letters. And then there's only 2 left in this guideline, 5.06, which is providing feedback to supervisees. Their example is kind of spot on. I do love this one, where they give an example of a BCBA who just kind of just goes in and does some quiet observations, doesn't take notes, doesn't really tell you anything that you're doing wrong. Everybody wants to work with him. His name is Jack. I think they were talking about me. I'm just kidding. And then, right, other supervisors come in and be like, wow, these supervisees are not doing a great job. And then Jack has to deliver, bad feedback or, constructive feedback, and everyone takes it very poorly because the whole time, he hadn't been saying anything. And now he has to, say, oh yeah, this whole time you haven't been doing a great job. I just didn't tell you. Right. And so for supervisees, I think this gives a supervisor an outlet to make sure that we're providing constructive feedback and positive feedback, both on, how we're performing, how we're speaking to other people, and how we're engaging in those problem solving skills as supervisees. So I think that that one is a good one to talk about and have, in our ethical belt for as a supervisor. And then the final one, is evaluating the effects of supervision, 5.07. Surprisingly, many supervisors forget that 5.07 is a thing now, and they don't incorporate feedback on their supervision, either formal or informal, right? So this part is critical because not only does it help us look at whether consumer performance is doing well, staff performance is doing well, right? And our own performance, right? And evaluating the effects of supervision can identify strengths of the supervisor, of the consumer, of the supervisee, and areas that we may need professional development, right? And if we're evaluating the effects of supervision and someone says, hey, you're not as culturally responsive as you could be, this is our cue to go out and get more training in this area. Pulling together all 7 under Guideline 5, it's critical for us as supervisors to make sure that we're incorporating ethics into our discussions at every single meeting with our supervisees, right, to highlight the importance of ethics, but also to tie in cultural responsiveness because we're dealing with people, right? And not all people are the same, nor should they be. That would be so boring.
I know I always struggle with, like we sort of were talking about earlier, what ways am I using to evaluate how well my supervisee is doing in regards to talking about culture? Like I said, especially if, there's not a client that the supervisee is working with that is from a diverse enough culture that I really feel like it's going to be an accurate representation of, whatever metric I decide to use, whether it's just sort of their fluency in talking about the client or just, a social validity scale that they have their, clients fill out. Sometimes like I worry that I'm missing some of those components. So again, sometimes it is just the, evaluating their ability to talk about culture in terms of contacting professional literature, or be able to identify pieces of an ethical scenario that relate to the working with the specific individual. And in culture can be very broad. It's not always someone from a diverse background. It could be, a diverse ethnic background. It could be a diverse socioeconomic background or religious background, or like Diana was saying, even a diverse neuro background. So, looking at what do we have, what's available in the literature that we can at least, work on together if we don't necessarily have a client that might kind of fall under sort of the auspices of needing to do more in-depth work regarding our, cultural responsiveness.
You're 100% right. I was going to pull us into dissemination station. We're here.
Here we are at the dissemination station. Kind of jumped the line there. I jumped over the turnstiles to get to the end in terms of talking about supervision. So tonight we talked a lot about ways to learn about cultural responsiveness, and unfortunately ways that might not be readily accessible to all of us. But it is good to know that there are other providers out there, professionals out there who are looking at ways to give more in-depth training in culture. I mean, we've had a lot of talks, even at the most recent BABIC conference, the Thompson Center Conference. So I think a lot of conferences are really trying to make sure that cultural responsiveness, cultural competence, social justice are really front and center in terms of workshops that are available. Because, so many professionals, I think, are getting to a point where they understand the need, they understand some of the basics, and we are really getting to that point where if we don't move beyond just, I learned about culture A, or I learned that it's important, or I learned how this ties into ethics, it's going to be very challenging to actually then practice cultural responsiveness. And it's very hard to teach others how to engage in cultural responsiveness if we as professionals don't know what we're doing in regards to cultural responsiveness. So I think looking at the ethics code is always important. I think thinking about the quality of some of these kind of pilot programs in terms of looking for what we want. I know for me, I know any workshop or any talk going forward that has a role-playing component or that allows me to engage with professionals who have more knowledge in this area or themselves from a diverse background and actively engaging them in, what does it mean to be culturally responsive? How am I doing with this? Whether it's a role play, whether it's a conversation, I think that's sort of where I feel I am in my own kind of journey in increasing my fluency in working with clients from diverse backgrounds. Jackie, how about you?
I have been, like Diana said earlier, been really trying to keep cultural context and responsiveness in the forefront of each of the classes that I'm revising. So every semester when a class is about to start, we basically try to do a pretty significant overhaul of the class based on the new literature and what's going on in the field. And I've been trying to include a lot more examples and more specific discussions about cultural responsiveness, and tie it into the ethical code, right? Even if we're not talking about ethics and it's not an ethics class, I've been trying to incorporate cultural competence and ethics into most all of the classes that we're having, just so that we have a lot of time and space to have those conversations, right? Because we're all coming to this, this one class or this one spot with different experiences. And I think it's important that everyone can share those experiences and we can all learn and grow together.
I know. I mean, I see Diana, prepping the new courses and spending so much time on them, and I just love that attitude about making new coursework and trying to put as much of these big picture ideas into all aspects of the course. Because I know for me, when I think of ethics, I think, I took a class on ethics, and I think that runs the same problem you get into when you think of diversity as like, sometimes I have to think of diversity because that person's different than me, so I guess I have to learn about diversity now. How that's such a very short-sighted way of responding to a real need in the field. If I think about diversity as something I only have to pay attention to when I blatantly notice a difference between myself and other, I'm not moving past that idea of diversity as people are different than me, and that difference is different, as opposed to which quote unquote is kind of wrong, as opposed to yes, everyone is different, and my understanding that difference and my own cultural background will allow me to be a better provider. I'm working for them. I'm not like, guess I have to read the cheat sheet on working with this population. It's the same as ethics. When it's a class, it's a separate class. I have to think of, sometimes I have to think of ethics, but most of the time I will ignore this until someone tells me, hey, it's ethics. You have to work on it. I want to be thinking about it all the time because that's the only way to get good at any of these skills in a way that will make meaningful change for the clients who are counting on you and want to work with you. Will hopefully want to work with you.
I do worry in this conversation that the overall experience that one gets in preparation for being a BCBA could be extremely variant depending on who functions as your supervisor and how well the classes that you have, let's say, incorporate some of these things, because there's not a lot of oversight currently with regard to, like we said, mandatoriness of inclusion of these considerations.
I 100% agree. That's why I'm so glad that we have peers to talk about it with too, right? Because it's scary to be making all these changes.
And again, you don't have to have your own podcast to reach out to some of these researchers. You can email them, their contact information is on the articles. And I think about 90% of the time, if I email an author for a copy of the article or with a question or what resource should I look for, I get a response back within a week at most with thank you so much for reaching out. I'm so excited to share this with you. So people are excited to share what they know. So please don't ever hesitate to think like, well, I don't know if I can reach out to any of the thinkers in the field on this topic or behavior analysts from a diverse background that might be able to share more about their experience that I can use to sort of reflect on my own culture and my own work.
Although it's not their responsibility.
No, it's not their responsibility, but more the general conversation, not necessarily tell me about yourself and your culture. You're right, Diane. I misspoke and was a little too directive in that. Sorry. But yeah, please do, because not all the answers are out there. I mean, like Diana said, we're getting to the end of the behavior analytic specific writings on the subject that have been recently published. There's always more out, which is great. I mean, I think this is an area that is getting a lot of really positive attention, but it's not necessarily something that, we're seeing a lot of talks, but, how many workshops do we have? I mean, I don't look through every program, for conferences, but that would be an excellent workshop. I think, if we have more in-person conferences next year, you could maybe do it over Zoom, I suppose, but it would be great to have some workshops where folks actually do some of the work that's described in these articles, where we talk about what are the signs of bias, what are the signs of stereotyping that we don't mean to do it, but we might engage in, and how can we perform ethically in terms of meeting our requirement to be culturally responsive to clients, Even if it's just a more in-depth discussion, I think would be a nice move into sort of the more advanced areas of this topic.
Now is the time for action, right? I think that we have a lot of nice thought pieces in the field on where things need to go, but that's really the next critical step is, how does this going to happen? How do we need to make sure that it happens? And I do like both of the articles we had for this week that were outside of our field, because they are a step ahead of us in thinking about how are we really going to break this down. That's what we need to start doing next, I think, is look at other examples of how to do this and then apply it to our own field. Maybe someone could even do some research on it.
Well, I think that
the end.
I think that brings us to the end of the episode, though not the conversation. But that's all the time we have for right now. And again, we'll come back to this topic. It's certainly not the end of it. And we love coming back to it and talking about what's been done, what needs to be done, and continuing that conversation. But in the meantime, I wanted to make sure everyone gets that last secret code word, and it is chime, CHIME. Like when you hear bells chime or your phone chimes to remind you, hey, there's something to do. I don't know what your phone's telling you to do, but, take a look. You probably wrote it down somewhere. Chime. And with that, it brings us to the end of today's episode of ABA Inside Track. We sure do hope you enjoyed it. If you did, or hey, maybe if you didn't, why not think about reaching out to us to give us some of our own feedback, or to tell us what you did or did not like, or your own thoughts on the issues of ethics and cultural responsiveness. A lot of ways you can do that. Number one, it'd be really great if you left us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you've subscribed to the show. If you haven't subscribed, why not do it right now to get a new episode every single week? You can also find these episodes posted on YouTube with the YouTube subtitling feature. You can find us and reach out to us on social media. We're everywhere as ABA Inside Track. We're on Facebook, Pinterest, Instagram, and Twitter. We also can be found on our website, abainsidetrack.com, where you can get CEs for our episodes and where you can find links to all of the articles discussed in our episodes. And of course, you can find us on our Patreon page, patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where you can sign up to get access to a monthly social meetup where, hey, sometimes we do talk about heavy issues like cultural responsiveness and our own work in bettering ourselves in this area. And you can also find extra long book club podcast where we do what we hope is the definitive discussion of many important books. We just did our first one a few months ago now on meaningful differences. So check us out there, patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, if you're interested in getting even more. And never hesitate to reach out to us. We don't have all the answers, certainly, but feel free to reach out to us anyway at abainsidetrack@gmail.com. Thank you to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro and outro music, Kyle Stroy for our interstitial music, Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his editing, and Hollis Irvin from Sycamore Workshop for his visual design. We'll be back next week with another full-length episode, but until then, keep responding. Bye.
Bye.